My name is Ralph Klein. I started teaching at Concordia in 1968 and was part of the whole controversy then that climaxed in 1974. I think every Christian has his or her Seminex moment when they have to claim their faith when it's challenged, but for other people, it happened in their own time, in their own way, and with different issues than the ones we face. It might be justice issues, it might be peace issues, it might be family issues, but at certain times of our life, we have to say yes and not no, or no and not yes. And so I think there are things to be learned there. And because that Seminex experience, looking back on it, in a sense it was a small little thing in church history. But for those of us who experienced it, it was life-changing, life-transforming. One thing that was different, I think, that when we look back to the 60s, so many things were changing in society, and so many people, I think, were thinking everything is coming unglued. Sexuality thing was a sexual revolution, the Vietnam, civil rights. There were just a lot of people who said, we have to find some place secure we can stand on. And so we are much more secular in our society today. I think that's what your question is reflecting. But I still think that people who are trying to be faithful, people who are trying to live the gospel, are going to find places where they say, I have to stand here. And of course, one thing that was so remarkable is the way people stood with us. We were without a church body, and we never missed a pay period because people were sending their checks every month and praying for us and meeting us. And you know about O.P. Kretzmann, the president of Valparaiso University, a storied man, and he wrote me right in the middle of the controversy. I didn't really know him. He said, Ralph, I've been a member of the church malignant for a long time. So you have to hang in there. I think it's probably an unrepeatable thing, but who knows what will be the next crisis that will call it forth. We have things in our country here that simply have to be opposed. the stupid wars we get involved in, things like that. And we get carried along by the tide of the times. But and the question was, is the gospel enough? Is the gospel enough? Is the freedom of the gospel enough? Or the gospel's not enough, so you have something else to base your faith on? Well, as we find people drifting from the church, the only thing they have to hold their life on now is the gospel, so that the church is not nearly as supportive as an institution as it once was. When the time came for deploying the Seminex faculty to here in Berkeley, et cetera, he opposed that because he thought the Seminex Moment had to be continued just as it was. But most people saw the controversy as regard the historicity of the Bible, which it was in many respects. But I think he and his colleague Robert Bertram saw that more was at stake in that, and that was the sufficiency of the gospel. We used to have people ask us questions like, could you take a picture of Adam and Eve? And the answer, this is 40 years ago, the answer then, you could take a picture, you couldn't get it developed anywhere. But then Bob Bertram, Ed's colleague, close friend, said, Ralph, when they're asking you that question, they're really asking you, did Jesus rise from the dead? They don't have the guts to ask that question, but that's the question you have to answer. And so I think Ed, who takes everything through this law gospel dynamic, that's what made it such an important moment for him, and that's what partly gave a bigger picture to the whole thing. I sometimes thought if we had been able to hang in there, could we have reformed the Missouri Synod from within? I think the answer to that is no. And our voice has been lost there so that they have spiraled off into a very conservative focus. But I think it was. It inspired a lot of people, inspired a lot of the students. I think about our present students at the seminary who were born 20 years after this happened. Everyone wants to ask a question and say, what was it like? And they want to know that story because it's an inspiring story for them that we and our colleagues, said that this is important to forget about tenure, forget about jobs, forget about institutions, and to stand up for the faith. I came from a very conservative background, I need to say. My father was a pastor. He died the summer before this all started to happen, which was actually good looking back, because it would have been a very painful thing for him. But it changed me in this way, that after Seminex had happened, I became unafraid to look at any Bible passage from a new perspective. We were always overlooking, watching what was happening behind us and saying, how do we say something that's acceptable here? And the old civil rights slogan, the only thing that we did wrong was stay in the wilderness too long. So I've been a major voice in the acceptance of gay and lesbian people in the church. I wouldn't have had the guts to do that in Missouri Synod. And I've gone on to other teaching and writing possibilities that this really freed me up in a way that I had not known. The sexuality struggle and the ELCA, in a certain sense, was a replay of this. Because when we were arguing back in the late 60s, early 70s, it was like creation and evolution. And we were saying, well, but the biblical writers lived with, 2000 BC type of science. And therefore we should recognize when they confess God as creator, they're doing it as 2,000-year-old people. And so, the Bible, for example, is a very positive view of sexuality, but it has half a dozen little passages that are narrow and cramped. And that's part of the presuppositions the biblical writers brought to the table. That's their limitation. You and I have our own limitations. The scariest thing a pastor ever does is listen to a sermon he preached 10 years ago, right? And so we have our presuppositions of which we are not aware until the next generation points them out to us. And so I think, well, I'm getting convoluted here now, but
that's all right. I'm going to edit.
Yeah, it's how we recognize where we are and what the questions are today, and how one remains faithful and how one remains insightful in a new situation. I mean, we treasure the scriptures because of the good news and the confidence they have, but we also recognize that the scriptures were written by human beings. I often tell a story about when my grandson was 5 years old. His mother, my daughter, asked him, what does Papa, that's me, what does Papa do for a living? Well, he says he works at a computer a lot. Shh, I'm busy. I didn't like that last comment. But I think, did Jeremiah say, I can't do anything around the house today because I'm writing the Bible? Just to put it that way, say, of course, that's not the way it happened. He was struggling, he was opposed, he was kicked out of the church, so to speak. And later on, people said what he said really made a lot of sense and really is worthwhile being preserved for all time. So,
are you hopeful?
I am very hopeful. I wake up every morning and say, this is the day the Lord made, and I can't wait to get on with. In fact, I've had a lifelong struggle with insomnia, and I can't wait to get at the next day.
Anything you'd like to add about this conference? What your hopes are for this?
Well, over half the Seminex professors have died. So this is probably the last time we'll ever get together. And, it's time to hand the torch on to a new generation. But, just down in the cafeteria just now, to see all these friends and students, who are now at retirement age, for God's sake, and to see the freedom and the courage they had back then. So this is a great homecoming. Our house is full of people right now. No place to lay your head at night, so it's just great to see these old friends. And when you've been through a struggle like this, you really recognize what's really important in your life.